Rails 3.1 has finally been released. To get a nice overview of the changes, check out the Rails 3.1 release notes, which I'll link to in the show notes. And also be sure to check out the past episodes that I've done on 3.1. But here, though, I want to focus on upgrading a 3.0 application to Rails 3.1. And the application I'll focus on upgrading is this application right here, the Railscast site. First of all, here are some steps to help prepare your app for the upgrade. First of all, make sure you're using the latest version of Rails 3.0, which is currently Rails 3.0.10. If you have an older version, first upgrade to this version. Next, if you have a test suite, make sure it completely passes under this version of Rails with no deprecation warnings. Here everything passes, so let's get started with the upgrade. I like to do it inside its own Git branch. So git checkout branch, we'll call it Rails 3.1. Now upgrading to Rails 3.1 is actually extremely simple. Just go to your gem file and change your Rails version to 3.1.0 or whatever the latest release is. And then run bundle update to get that new version. The only other change I found to be necessary is inside of the development config file. Find the line that says debug RJS and just remove that line. And if we run our specs again, you can see that they're all passing. So that was easy. We can even start up our server to take a look at it. So let's try visiting this. And you can see that that looks good as well. So it looks like everything's working, but this is all running Rails 3.1. Now you may be wondering, what about the asset pipeline we've been hearing about in Rails 3.1? Well, as you can see here in this application, in the public directory here, it still contains our JavaScripts and style sheets. So we're not taking advantage of the asset pipeline at all here. In fact, the asset pipeline is completely optional and it doesn't take into effect until we enable it. So this is really nice because if you aren't sure about the asset pipeline, don't let that stop you from upgrading to Rails 3.1. As you saw, the upgrade was completely painless and the asset pipeline is optional. But if you do want to take advantage of the awesome new features that provides, you'll have to enable it. So let's see what that involves. First, go into your gem file and add the following lines. This is just what's generated by the Rails 3.1 app generator. Basically, you make an assets group and include the asset related gems there, and also the jQuery Rails gem if you want to use jQuery. I think there's a prototype Rails gem out there as well if the app you're upgrading uses prototype instead. Next, go into your application config file and look for this bundler require line and replace it with the following code here. This basically includes the assets group when you're requiring from bundler. We need to enable the asset pipeline here as well. So inside of the application class, just add a few lines here for enabling the asset pipeline. Basically set config assets enable to true and give it a version number, which you can change to expire your assets. Now we also need to change the configuration settings in each of the environment config files. So let's start off with the development file. There are a couple settings we need to change here, so I'll just paste them in. One is for telling it not to compress the assets, and then the other one is to enable asset debugging. There are also a few options to set in production. I'll just paste them into the bottom here. One is to tell it to compress the assets and also not to compile the assets because we don't want it to fall back on the asset pipeline if we're going to precompile them, and also to do a digest inside of the URLs. Now you might want to configure these options depending on how you want it to work in production. And lastly, we have our test environment, which just has a couple options here, telling it to serve static assets and to enable debugging of the assets. And that's it for environment config settings. I'll include all the code in the show notes so you can easily copy and paste it into your various files. Also, if you have a .getignore file, open it up and add to it the .sas-cache directory here so it ignores that because you don't want to include your SAS cache in Git. Alright, now that our asset pipeline is all configured, it's time to create the app assets directory. So let me make a new directory in here called assets. And then we can move our images, JavaScripts, and style sheets from our public directory into the app assets directory. And some of these files we no longer need, such as the jQuery files, because those are included inside of the jQuery gem now. And you may also want to move some files into libassets or vendor assets, such as jQuery plugins, like I showed in episode number 279. Next, we need to create the manifest files, and as you can see, this project already has application.js and application.css files here. But if you don't have these files, that's okay, just create them. And let's start with our CSS file. So to turn this into a manifest file, just place some comments at the top here, and then we can tell it to include whatever we want here. So we can say require self, and we can say require tree, and we'll require all the other files that are inside of the style sheets directory here. So we can do the same thing inside of our application.js file here as well, but it's a little bit different because we need to include jQuery as well. So we can say require jQuery and require jQuery UJS, which will substitute for that Rails.js file we deleted. And let's require self because this includes some JavaScript inside of this manifest file. And we can require tree in case we add some more JavaScript files inside of here so that they're all loaded as well. The last step is to go into your application's layout file and change the style sheet and JavaScript include tag calls to only reference the application file because everything else will automatically be included through the asset pipeline. Now, in this case, I have an external JavaScript file here, which is a Sublime video player, which is not going to be included through the asset pipeline, of course, so I still need to keep that reference here. All right, now it's time to try this out. Run the bundle command if you need to install all of those gems we added, and then finally, let's start up the server. So let's load this in the browser, and it looks like everything mostly works, except you might find some images broken like our logo up here. Well, what's the problem with this? Now, if we check out the layout file, you can see right here is where I'm referencing that logo image. And you can see it's some static HTML, which references the /images path. And of course, this won't work because our images are no longer under the public images directory. Now, one thing you may think of as working is changing this to /assets. And this will appear to work in development mode, but in production you're going to run into issues because if you have that digest URL option enabled, like I showed you in the production environment config, it's going to add a hash at the end of the name. And so the static reference to that path will no longer work. So whenever you're referencing assets, it's a good idea to use the helper methods. So in this case, let's just change this to use the application or the image tag helper method so that it references that logo directly and it can link everything up in both development and production. So make sure to do a global search for all places where you're statically referencing a given asset and fix those. So if we reload the page here, you can see our logo now works. So this means our asset pipeline is all working now, and we're pretty much done with our upgrade to Rails 3.1. Now there are other features you probably want to take advantage of in this release, so be sure to check out the past episodes that I've done on this topic. And that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.